Well, thank you. So, and I'm assuming I need a mic. My voice doesn't carry very much, so let me know if you don't hear me. Thank you so much for having me here,
So good
Sandy.
To see you.
And as always, delighted. And thank you for letting me share my father's story tonight.
Hold it?
I sure can. Would that be better? Absolutely. Okay, here I go. And again, thank you for letting me share my father's story tonight. It's a privilege to be here. And Sandy, you know, I just wanted to add how extraordinary it is, right? Because our parents were the same age. So when her mother, well, she was a year older, 15-year-old, was in Auschwitz, my father was sent into a foxhole to shoot down Russian tanks in Austria, not expecting him to survive, and he was 14 years old, right? So, and this is why I think the story is perhaps less usual, because one doesn't hear so much usually about that side, right? And that's why I thought the story was interesting and hopefully of value, right, to folks to listen to. And please feel free to ask me any questions. We'll have some time for Q&A. And the book's name is Save the Last Bullet. This is his story as he told it to me. This took a long time. My father never wanted to talk about the war, as is very common with veterans and survivors. And it was only in his later days, when he was 77 years old, when he agreed to do that. And he narrated in German on 16 cassette tapes, his story to me. And then he put it on CDs, which for him was a big feat because he was no friend of modern technology. So for him, that was a big deal. Yeah, he thought cell phones were the devil, and he'd turn them off and put them in a drawer, and you know. And then I listened to it with great attention, and then put them in a drawer for many years until about 2016. My father became very concerned shortly before his death. He became very concerned about the geopolitical events unfolding in the world, and he had dedicated his entire life to the furthering of democracy in Europe, to ensure that what he had lived through never happened again. And he was worried that it was unraveling, that his legacy was getting destroyed. And so that's what prompted me to take out the tapes and to translate them for my family. My daughter's here this evening, and that was all I was going to do. And then, you know, a friend who was a writer convinced me that this was a book, and I thought it was crazy. And then, well, anyway, in the end, it did happen. So that's my story, and without further ado, I will start with a little bit of history. So my dad was born in a small town called Witten, which is in the neighborhood of Dortmund and close to the city of Cologne, which you may be more familiar with, and Bonn. And that's in Westphalia, Nordrhein-Westfalen, which is close to the Netherlands and Belgium. And so you can see the cutout on the map. My father was born. My father's name was Wilhelm, and he was born in 1930 in this little town. His mom came from a big farming family, and his dad was, he was a railway employee, and his dad, you know, had a dry cleaners. So regular folks. And so in 1933, as you probably know, Hitler came to power, right? He was elected Chancellor of Germany, and he quickly seized total authoritarian power by a ploy that he employed. The Reichstag, which is the German parliament, caught on fire. And this was arson, and Hitler blamed it on the communists. This is much debated whether that was really what happened. Then he declared a state of emergency, upon which he took absolute powers, which he of course never relinquished. And that is how he came actually to power. By 1935, you could see many things changing. In fact, the laws changed against the Jews. right? The Jewish population was very numerous in Germany, was disenfranchised already in 1935. Right? They created two classes of citizens, the non-Jewish citizens and the Jewish citizens who had less rights. Another thing that happened is that in textbooks in school, the wording was changed. And you can see that by comparing textbooks from before 1935 and after 35. There was wording, for instance, cultural values, family, tradition, church were mentioned in these textbooks, right? Your family, your parents, you have to respect your parents, you have to go to church, you believe in God. All that started shifting, and you saw those references disappear, and then references to fatherland, blood and soil, Hitler as the savior and source of all truth. And this sort of infiltrated into the textbooks. This was just before my father started school in 1936, at 6 years old. In 1938, my father was actually witness to the aftermath of Kristallnacht, which was the night of the 9th to the 10th, where thousands of Jewish businesses were destroyed and hundreds of synagogues were set on fire, and many people were hurt or lost their lives. And this was supposedly a spontaneous act by the people of Germany in outrage over the assassination of a German ambassador in Paris, in France, by a Jewish dissident. This was not a spontaneous attack. It was orchestrated by the Nazis and was very successful. My father was 8. He remembered being taken to school by his dad, and his dad was nervous. And he remembered seeing a glow. He realized much later, when he was an adult, that it actually witnessed the aftermath of Kristallnacht, and those were fires. And so he was then taken to school by his dad, who obviously knew what was going on, and he wanted to protect his son by taking him to school physically, because kids back then all walked to school on their own, right? And he saw next to his school, very close to his school, was a synagogue, and it had burned down. And he saw the firefighters dousing the fire, and he was very disturbed by that sight. He asked questions, and he was, of course, never given any answers. In 1939, the war started, right? In September, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. In 1939, that's my dad, first day of school. So that's the big family, that's the big farming family right there, 12 kids. And these are my grandparents and my dad. In 1939, something interesting happened besides the war starting. You may be familiar with this institution, the Hitler Youth, right? You've perhaps heard about it. Okay, so the Hitler Youth had a precursor, which was the Jungvolk. And so this was like, these organizations were voluntary outdoor sports organizations, very much like the Cub Scouts and the Boy Scouts, and they were appropriated by Hitler in order to influence the children, right, and to bring them closer to the ideology, right? So he appropriated these institutions and used them for himself. These were voluntary. In 1935, they became mandatory. So every boy, age 10, was automatically enrolled in the Jungvolk. At age 14, automatically enrolled in Hitler Youth, so there was no choice. And then at 18, during wartime, they went directly into the armed forces, right? So they were conscripted into the army. So this is now 1939. My father turns 10 a year later in 1940, and he, in fact, does get enrolled in Jungvolk. In 1943, something else happened. There was a program called the Kinderlandverschickung, which is closely translated to English as a relocation program for children. This was purportedly a relocation program for city children to protect them from the heavy bombing of the Allied forces. Now that makes sense, right? You'd think, well, yes. So that was the superficial reason. There was another reason behind it. And the reason behind it was that it was very conveniently taking these children away from the influence of their families and from the church, and to be properly indoctrinated into the Nazi doctrine, ideology, and also these are males, so they're now going to be trained to fight. Now these are children, right? And they typically would go with the entire classroom. So my father and his entire classroom, so they're 13-year-olds, are taken away from their families, put on trains with little tags, and go into a foster family. My father ended up at the border with Switzerland with his class, and they took the teachers too. So the teachers would go, and then they had one Nazi handler, and that Nazi handler made sure that nobody stepped out of line and that the teachers were teaching proper Nazi ideology to these children, and they reported on a daily basis directly to headquarters in Berlin. So they were very closely watched. In 1944, so my father doesn't see his parents anymore, not until the war ended. My father was tall. He's a big kid. And so in 1944, the SS showed up at the school. And they picked out 3 kids, my father and 2 other boys, because they were the biggest. And they said, a great honor has been bestowed on you. You get to lay your life down for the Führer, and you are going to be conscripted in the German army and or other armed forces. And this is a great privilege. You will be trained for 2 months, and then you'll be sent back to school, and then you will wait until the time comes for you to sacrifice yourselves. So this was, of course, not an option either. They went and took the training where they were instructed in the use of weapons, such as machine guns, Panzerfaust, which is a bazooka-like weapon that my father actually was then instructed to and did use, which is a single-shot anti-tank rocket launcher. It has great precision, but it only can be fired once. And then pistols and other weapons. They send them, they do the training for 2 months, they send them back to school. Now things are getting very, very bad for Germany. Of course, the war has now turned. At the end of 1944, conditions are dire. There's widespread famine. There is now danger even at the borders. There's massive emigration out of the eastern states into Germany. A lot of displaced people. So they moved the kids to a remote village in the Alps, in the German Alps called Schleching. And they stay there. They are on starvation diet. There is no food. The livestock has long been eaten. There is no more agriculture. It's an alpine village, so these kids eat beets, beet soup, morning, midday and night. That's all they get, and a piece of bread here and there. And so they're very hungry, and so they start stealing. Right? So they go into the village at night and they swipe what they can, they break into cellars, they try to get any food. And there was this butcher, and so they had a predilection for the butcher's cellar, because the butcher's cellar, they figured out how to get in, and so they kept taking his provisions, his sausages, and they stuffed them in their pants, and it would run out, and in February, so now it's 45, so now we're in the end of the war already. They don't know this, of course, but the SS shows up again. February 1945, they show up and they set up camp, and they have a lot of food. They have provisions. And so the kids see this, and one kid decides to have a great idea to go steal from the SS. Well, the kid got caught red-handed. He was 14. And so the next day, they lined all of the children up in the back of the building, and they put the kid in front, and they executed him in front of all of his classmates to make an example out of him, that you did not disobey the Führer. right? And you didn't steal from the SS. So my father never forgot that, and that's one of the things he had the most trouble talking about. Barely a month later, less than a month later, in March, the 19th of March, the day came. So they came, an army truck came and picked them up. They had actually been given a choice by the SS officer, and they said you can either join the SS and you'll be very well fed, or you can join the regular armed forces. And all three boys picked the regular armed forces because by that time they had figured out that the SS was really creepy. So they went with the army truck, and they went to what was the Russian front at the time, which was already in Austria, right? So the Russians had already advanced, and they were at the gates of Vienna. And you may remember, if you know World War II history, the Battle of Vienna was probably the most famous last battle. My father was in the precursor battle the day before. So he was placed, and it was March 31st or April 1st, we don't know the exact date, in Wiener Neustadt, which is the city right before Vienna, to stave off the advance of the Russians. So they have all these kids, and they tell them to dig foxholes and line up to wait for the tanks. So he was in an armored tank division, and so he had the anti-rocket launchers, and were waiting for the Russian tanks to come in. So he was issued 4 of these, so you can only shoot them once, so he could shoot 4 tanks. And then he had his machine gun and he had a pistol. And so he had really good aim, so he managed to survive. But he saw all of his friends being crushed by the tanks or beheaded. He jumped out when he ran out of ammunition. He jumped out, and he literally ran into, as he jumped out, into a kid. He says he was a Russian kid, not much older than himself. The kid bayoneted his leg and sliced him open. And the Nazi handlers, had instructed all of the children to keep the last bullet in the pistol for themselves, to kill themselves, because to be taken prisoner by the Russians was a fate worse than death, because they would be tortured before they were killed, and that was mostly true. So he used that last bullet and shot the kid. So he managed to survive. He was bleeding to death, but he managed to survive because 2 comrades saw him and took him to safety. And then as a reward for that, they stitched him up, and 2 days later he was back in the front. So then what happened later was that they retreated. So they realized, so what was left of his unit realized that all was lost. So they started retreating west, northwest, because they had heard that that Germany was going to be divided into different Allied camps, and there was going to be a Russian section and an American section. And so, of course, they wanted to make it to that what was called the demarcation line between the Russian and the American side. And so they were in a mad rush to get there, and the demarcation line was north of a river. So they had to cross this river. The river ends in a city called Lietzen in Austria. They made it on May the 8th, and unbeknownst to them, the war had just ended. So they did not know this at the time. So they made it. And in fact, ran into Americans. And then the unit surrendered to the Americans, to the US forces. They were made to wait in a meadow for 3 days to get picked up. And in the meantime, on May 10th, President Truman approved the famous JCS 1067, which explained that no steps were ever to be taken to rehabilitate Germany. And it was to remain an agrarian state forever. That, of course, was changed later. But that was the situation at the time. My father turned 12 on that, turned 15 on the 12th of May in that meadow, waiting for the Americans to take him to the internment camp. So it was very interesting because the people that got taken prisoner at that time, like my father, were actually taken prisoner after the war. So they were not prisoners of war. They were not POWs. They were interned persons. And the Americans didn't quite know what to do with them because they didn't fit. But so they had them in these internment camps, which were around the city of Munich. So there were several. And they were open air camps, really. I mean, so there was really, it was a grassy area with some barbed wire. And then they would build some makeshift, temporary buildings to house the prisoners. So he was there for about 2 months, or a month and a half. And then on June the 16th, they were told that they were going to be released. He saw a line forming, and there was a man sitting at a desk and asking the prisoners questions. And he noticed as he got closer that he asked what their peacetime occupation was. And he noticed that those men who said that they were farmers went to a different line from the ones that said anything else. And, he was pretty quick on his feet, so he figured farmers, they're going home. So when his turn came, he said he was a farmer and a student. He went to that line, and sure enough, they sent those home. And the other folks that went to the other line all were sent to sweep mines in France, and didn't get home till, if they survived, didn't get home till 47 or 48. So he is, however, mandated to serve 1 year forced labor. So they didn't just go free, right? So he was mandated to do 1 year of forced farm labor. And he served his time. In 1946, he was basically he reintegrated, went back into school. He'd lost, a couple of years, obviously. And this is actually when my father learned about the Holocaust. So my father knew as a child that something wasn't right? He saw the synagogue burn. He noticed when he was 11 in 41 that the Jews had a star. Now his village didn't have, it was a small town that didn't have a big Jewish population, but their neighbors were Jewish. So there was a Jewish gentleman and his wife who was a non-Jew. They were married, they had a young child. He was about 2 and my father was 8, I think, around that time. My grandmother and the lady were very good friends. They ran a shoe store. And so my grandmother was often sick. We've never known what it was. They said it was a blood illness. Those days they didn't really tell you. And so she was indisposed, and so the friend would babysit my dad. And so he played with the little boy. Unfortunately, in 1943, the gentleman was deported. They tried to have the woman divorce her husband. She refused, which immediately made her be ostracized. But they didn't take her to the concentration camp. They sent the gentleman to the Theresienstadt ghetto in 1943, but left the woman and the child to fend for themselves. They took away all their privileges. She was not allowed to work, and she was not allowed food stamps, so she was basically going to starve. So my grandparents, and other neighbors would slip her food. And so what happened then in the meantime was a blur for my father, because he was taken when he was 13, so he really wasn't privy to a lot of information. And then when he was in the internment camp, the Americans showed the Germans the pictures of the concentration camps. And so he remembers seeing it, and it was so horrific that he believed that it was American propaganda to demonize the Germans. It couldn't possibly be true. And so then he goes into forced labor, so he's not in school until 46. There were some attempts at denazification, so they would give, in schools, they would give lectures and educate the kids. My father missed that. And so then he started being told stories, and then in instruction in school, they started talking about it. And that's when he found out. He asked his mother what happened to this family. And that was actually a beautiful story, because, we have a technical issue. So in the meantime, I'll talk. So he asked her what happened to this family. And so what happened to the family, it's actually a beautiful story. In 1945, women or men who were married to Jews who had not yet been deported were getting deported, and their children, because they were considered half-breeds. So they were going to get exterminated as well. So my grandparents, at great peril to their own lives, actually I credit them for that, hid the woman and the child in their cellar, and they survived. And what's more miraculous is that the gentleman survived, and he walked back from Theresienstadt. Apparently he walked, and made it back. And they stayed together, and they stayed in Germany, which is remarkable. And the gentleman rebuilt his shoe store. And it's still here to this day. And I had the privilege to meet the descendant, so the daughter of that little boy, who is about my age, a little bit younger, who's still running the store today, and she corroborated the whole story. And so we had a great talk. It was about 2 years ago. So anyway, my father, when he realized this, he felt completely violated. He was extremely angry. Because he felt he had been made complicit in something that he had absolutely no control over or no knowledge of. And he went into a deep depression. A British soldier helped him out of that because he was in the British occupied zone, and the British military was helping with the schools. And so they had a sports programs and a soccer program. And so my dad joined that. And this British soldier gave him hope for the future. And he told him, look, you're a bright kid, you speak English. My father was very talented with languages. He spoke seven languages fluently. And so he said, there's future for Germany. It could join, a greater Europe. And so that gave my father inspiration. So my father ended up actually following that path. So he determined that he was going to dedicate his life to the furtherment of democracy in Europe, and to ensuring that what he had witnessed and what he had lived through never would happen again. He became a lawyer. He worked for the German Department of Defense for the Foreign Service. In 1979, he was awarded the European Medal of Merit for his work in the furthering of democracy in Europe. And that is the certificate right there. And that is actually his discharge papers from the American internment camp in Munich. And that's my dad graduating from high school. And that's actually my dad and I in 2014, a few years before he passed away. And then he joined NATO. He was the German head of legal for NATO Germany, and if any of you are interested in World War II, he authored the contract for the Tornado airplane, which was the NATO signature plane, and was in operation until just recently. And so then, yes, in 2007, he agreed to record his memoirs, and sadly he passed away in 2018. Before I published the book, but I've told them since that they got published. So. And that is the story. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them as best as I can. All right.
Well, I'm going to give her a round of applause.
Yes.
When the children were taken away, was that boys and girls?
Yes, it was boys. I didn't talk a lot about girls. Oh, the mic.
The mic is fine. It could be your computer that said that you were running low.
Yeah. Okay. But everything seems to be working now. The girls were taken away too. They were separated from the boys, so they typically weren't located in the same schools or foster homes. But yes, they were. The girls had, there was less emphasis on girls because the boys were being, at the end of war especially, prepared for, being conscripted into the armed forces to defend Germany because it wasn't going well and the Germans were running out of men. And so they started enlisting the younger and younger children and older men, right? And there was another thing that they did, which was the Volkssturm, which is different. And, you know, again, for those who know a little bit about World War II history, that might ring a bell. And that's when the civilians were engaged, right? So the Nazis then went into the civilian population and said, they gave them, you know, whatever weapons they had, and they said, here, barricade yourselves and, you know, fight to the death. That was different. So my father was actually put in the army at age 14, right, in 1945, which is pretty extraordinary, right, that it's a very young age.
Were the young girls involved in the war?
Not well, so they were supposed to be, they were in Bund Deutsche Mädchen, which is the female counterpart, it's like the Girl Scouts, right, female counterpart of Hitlerjugend, and they were taught to be good German housewives and to have as many children as possible for the Führer. That was their job. And there's another story about that, right? So they had literally Führer baby factories. And so they had women who were volunteered or did volunteer on their own to bear children for the Führer. Yeah. Yeah.
How did your family get over here?
We didn't. No, my parents lived and stayed in Europe. My father, you know, worked again for the Foreign Service, but within Europe, and was stationed in different countries in Europe. My mother was from Spain. I came here accidentally. So I was minding my own business. I was on vacation in Italy at a very young age and ran into an American soldier. So, you know, I can't believe it's so corny, right? But that really happened. Yeah. And yeah, and the rest is history. And here's my beautiful daughter. And we will be married 40 years this April. Yeah. So. Yeah, so I came. That's how I came. So really nothing to do with my dad. My dad actually said, really, an American soldier? Are you kidding me? I'm like, yeah. But that's all he said. So they got along just fine. Yes, sir.
Did he actually save the last bullet?
He did.
And you haven't?
Well, he saved it, and then he had to shoot the Russian kid, because the Russian kid was going to kill him, so he used it. So he didn't save it. He didn't save it for himself. But he had saved it, and it's probably a good thing for him that he did, because he had one left, right?
Did your father walk with a limp? Did he have a scar from the weight?
He did have a huge scar, but he didn't walk with a limp. And I never paid attention to that scar other than remembering it was there. And it was the length of most of his leg, yeah. And, you know, and that's one of the things that as I got to be a teenager, I kind of asked, like, well, where did I come from, right? And so, you know, he started saying little things here and there. And that's kind of, I pieced it together, and I, you know, started asking him more questions. Yes?
Tell them about the toes.
The toes. Oh, the toes, as in he never regained feeling.
Yeah, the socks.
Oh, the socks. Yeah. Well, you know, it's, yeah, the war stories are not pretty. So he never took off his boots from the day he was put in the war until after his imprisonment was over. And so he got very very sick, and they had them back when they finally transported them back to their hometowns. The hometowns were, of course, destroyed. There was nothing left. His hometown was destroyed at, I think it was 85% destroyed. And he had no idea where his parents or his family was. And so he was in a transport very much like the Jewish transports, in an open car transport that's used usually for animals. And they were boxed in there, you know, with no room to move. And my father was actually sitting. So if you have the open box transport, the open door, there was a metal, I think it was a metal, it wasn't a rope, it was a metal chain across so they wouldn't fall out. But my father was sitting with his legs dangling down, and he didn't move for 14 days. And so they kept pushing the dead people over his head. He remembers that. And they had no food or drink, barely, just very little. And so when they were told to get off, he couldn't move. He was paralyzed from the waist down, because he had not moved for 14 days. And so he did end up getting taken to the hospital. They thought he was dead, but they threw him in a truck and made it to the hospital. And then so he survived. Luckily, he regained the use of most of his limbs, except for his toes. And what happened also is that the socks had fused to his skin, and they had to rip them off with the skin. So, but he had no feeling in his left foot. He never regained the feeling in his left foot. But it's fine. He didn't walk with a limp. You wouldn't have been able to tell, really. Yeah. So, considering he was very lucky. Yes?
Did he ever find his siblings?
Did he ever
He was an only child.
Oh, he was an only child.
He was an only
I thought
child.
you said
Yeah.
children of 12. Did
Yeah, but that was the grandma. Yeah.
Did he ever reunite with any of them?
Yeah, well, so some died. Some had passed away on the Russian front, several of the cousins. But the farming community usually stayed relatively safe, so the older folks who were farmers did survive, and his parents survived, even though the house was burned to the ground in the Allied bombings, and the entire town was razed to the ground. They did make it. They survived. Yeah.
What did Willie's father do during the war?
He was a railway employee. And so he was, I think he was in charge of the storeroom at the train station. And so he was a state employer, federal employee, I guess is what you would call it. Yeah.
Has the book been translated back to German, and how has it been received?
It has not, interestingly enough. So I had to write it in English because I was here. And I basically had to teach myself, and I went to classes to learn how to write. And so I kind of had to be in English. And it was published by a British publishing company. I have had some conversations about, and I would like to translate it into and have it published in the Spanish language and in the German language if possible. But yeah, still working on that. Thank you. Yes?
Do you know the name of his hometown?
Yes, it's Witten. You know, isn't there's a gentleman, is he a football player? His last name is Witten, W-I-T-T-E-N. That's the name of the town. So, yeah, and it is in that region close to the Netherlands and Belgium. So it's northeast Germany. Yes?
What was the year again that he agreed to write the memoir?
2007.
And do you remember what prompted him to agree at that point?
I'd finally wore him down. I bugged him so much, he was like, fine. And I think, he was getting older, he was 77, and I think he started thinking about his life and thought, well, maybe she has a point. Maybe, these stories should be told so somebody will know about it, and it doesn't get lost, right, forever. Which is the whole point of the Holocaust exhibit too, right? We want to remember these things for future generations so that folks know. I mean, I see some young kids in the audience here, and I'm really encouraged by seeing that. I think that's really cool. And if you think about it, I mean, I don't know your age, but I mean, picture yourself, right? At age 14, sitting in a foxhole with, trying to shoot at tanks, right? So it's pretty, and so maybe it can encourage some reflection about what, devastation war really wreaks on. Yes?
You said your father didn't really know about the Holocaust and things that were going on. Did his parents?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they did, obviously. But not to the extent, so the civilian population, most of the civilian population wasn't aware of the extent of the atrocities that were being, but they didn't say anything. And it was a very brutal authoritarian regime. And the regime was led by fear and intimidation. If somebody spoke up on behalf of either the Jewish population or anybody who didn't agree, or God forbid was a political dissenter, they were sent to the concentration camps, or they just disappeared, or they just lost their jobs, right? So all of a sudden they couldn't feed their families anymore, And pretty soon, worse things happened, right? All of a sudden, you know, they had an accident, or, you know, things started happening to people. And people see that. And of course, then most people just keep their heads down because they're scared. And they're more scared, I think they're more worried about their families and what would happen to their families. And so, yeah, they didn't do much. You know, that's why I have to credit my grandparents for doing something, you know.
How did your grandmother hide or feed her friend who was married to somebody Jewish?
Yeah, so her friend, again, was left behind, so they took the husband, right? Because at the time they didn't take the Aryans, even though if they refused to divorce, they would be completely ostracized from society, but they left him. They were neighbors, so I'm assuming she would just, you know, bring food over to her when nobody was watching. And that went on for a while. But then it was in 45, so it was at the very end when the Nazis became very desperate, right? They were killing their own, right? So if a soldier, in fact that's in the book, right? If a soldier was lost from his unit and had gotten separated, the SS would capture their own soldiers and hang them. Like they would lynch them from a tree, or shoot them, because they were considered deserters, and defeat was not an option, and giving yourself up or surrendering was not an option. You had to die. So it was victory or death. There was no other option. And so it was it was a very, very brutal regime. And so, you know, those were the circumstances at the time that he encountered.
Did your father like what he did at the beginning when he was joining, and did anybody ever question him about living next door to a Jew or anything like that?
You know, I don't know, because in the book, so of course it's his recollection as a young child, right? So what he remembered is a conversation at one point that was sort of hushed, whispered between his parents, and something about his mother not being happy that she couldn't go to the shoe store anymore. And my grandfather, her husband, saying, "Hush, you're going to get us all in trouble." And so that's why he knew, he sensed, you know, something wasn't right. And then he knew, and then all of a sudden he couldn't go see his friend anymore. You know, so, but you know, I think also children in those days were maybe in some respects less mature or less grown. They were, so an 11-year-old was a younger 11-year-old than I think they are today, because, you know, you didn't have as much access to information or to social media, and to, you know, they remained, I think, a little bit more naive. And while he could definitely sense something wasn't right, you know, he couldn't really put his finger on it until later. Yeah, I mean, he put two and two together later, and he realized what was going on, and how horrible it was. Yeah. Okay. Oh, one more question.
There's actually a movie with the same title, but it's not related to the story. Is there any move to turn this into a mainstream?
Well, you know, if you know somebody, I'm ready to talk to them. No deal yet. I'm open to suggestions. Yes.
How long did your father serve in the war?
Not very long. That's why he probably survived. So he got in. He was taken out of that camp and picked up, he believes, on March 19th, 45, and the war ended May 8th. Right. So a couple months. You know, pretty intense couple months, but yeah, well, luckily not longer than that. Good question. All right. Yes. Oh gosh, I got more questions.
Did you ever talk about nightmares or needing some mental health?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, you didn't talk about it. So he was told when he returned, and that's all in the book, so it's a long story. But anyway, when he returned, he was essentially told, this never happened. You are not to speak about it. You never were in the army. You're crazy. You're 14. Of course you weren't. Shut up. Right? That was it. So he never spoke of it again. He had nightmares on a daily basis. I remember him waking up every night and asking my mother what was going on. And she was like, no, it's just, just a nightmare. And then, I put 2 and 2 together later. Obviously, the nightmares were caused by the PTSD. Yeah, he did. He took, even in his late years, he couldn't get over it. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he felt like he hadn't done enough, and he had to do more. And he would watch, when he would watch documentaries of the Holocaust, he would cry. Yeah, he'd say, I can't believe I did this. Right. Yeah.
It's very interesting that it sounds like he didn't really talk to you much until later.
Later.
After you were older.
Yeah.
And you have siblings too? Are they aware?
I have one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how did that get started? How did he break down, in a sense, to talk to you?
I think gradually he started, questions. I kept asking him questions about the family and this and that. So it's like just kind of get it out of him. My sister is quite a bit younger than I am, and I think she was maybe a little bit less interested, just because less interested in perhaps in history in general. She was interested, but I think less focused. And I'm pretty relentless, so I just kept bugging him, and I'm glad that he did. And I still have those tapes. So I have his voice, which is cool, right? I have his voice forever. So.
Heidi, did you ever ask him something and he said, I cannot talk about it?
Oh, yeah.
Did he ever say, I can't go there?
No, he'd say, I don't remember.
I don't remember?
Like your mom.
Convenient.
Oh, I don't remember. Yeah. No, there are a lot of things that are horrible that he did talk about. So I can only imagine the things he didn't, right? Because there were a lot of things he didn't talk about. Yeah. Like every survivor of war, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the hope is not to repeat it.